Welcome to your new life as a medieval peasant. Breakfast? Bread? Lunch? Bread? Dinner? Oh, you're in for a treat. It's bread. Forget variety, you're a medieval peasant. Your diet is bread, with a side of bread. Bread isn't just a food, it's the center of your existence. If there's bread, you live. If there isn't, you starve. It's that simple. For peasants, bread was usually made from rye, barley, or oats, grains that grew well in poor soil and didn't complain about cold weather. Wheat bread was for the rich, the nobles, and the occasional lucky peasant invited to a feast. Your bread was darker, denser, and had a texture that could double as construction material. If you were poor enough, it might even be bulked out with peas, beans, or acorns. Yes, acorns. And yes, they tasted exactly like you'd expect. The bread wasn't just a side dish, it was the dish. You'd eat it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, sometimes softened in broth if you wanted to feel fancy. And when it went stale, you didn't throw it out. You used it as a plate. Literally. A trencher was a chunk of stale bread that soaked up your stew or pottage, and when you finished eating the stew, you ate the trencher too. It was the medieval version of edible tableware, and also the reason your bread always tasted faintly of yesterday's dinner. Pottage was the other cornerstone of your diet. Think of it as everything you can find in a pot and boil until it stops moving. Grains, beans, vegetables, maybe a scrap of meat if you were lucky, all simmered together for hours. It was cheap, filling, and could be stretched out for days by adding more water. Flavor was optional. Breakfast? Probably bread dipped in ale. Lunch? Bread with a bit of cheese or cold pottage. Dinner? More bread, with hot pottage this time, because you're living the dream. On a really good day, you might have some butter or a slice of bacon to go with it. On a bad day, you just had bread and prayed it would be enough. Bread was so important that bad harvests could lead to bread riots, long before anyone invented the word riot. If the grain store ran low, the whole village was in trouble. People would grind whatever they could find into flour, peas, beans, chestnuts, and hope the bread held together long enough to be edible. And here's the kicker. Even when the harvest was good, bread still wasn't fluffy bakery fresh. It was heavy. It was dense. It filled you up fast because it had to keep you going through hours of hard labor in the fields. So yes, as a medieval peasant, bread was your life. It was your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner, your plate, your emergency ration, and occasionally your weapon if it went stale enough. If you could bake it, you survived. If you couldn't, well, at least the neighbors would have something to talk about at your funeral. If bread was the king of the peasant diet, vegetables were the loyal but slightly boring advisors. You ate them because you had to, not because you were excited. The classics were cabbage, onions, and leeks. Cabbage because it grew easily, onions because they kept well, and leeks because they made you feel like you were eating something fancier than you actually were. Beans and peas were also staples, dried in summer, soaked in winter, and boiled until they surrendered all texture and joy. Carrots were around too, but not the bright orange ones you're thinking of. Those were a later invention. Medieval carrots were purple, yellow, or white, and they looked like they belonged in a fantasy novel. Beets, turnips, and parsnips rounded out your root vegetable roster because nothing says fine dining like food that tastes faintly of dirt no matter what you do to it. Fruit was seasonal. If it was summer, you might have apples, pears, berries, or plums fresh off the tree. If it was winter, you had whatever you dried, stored, or stole from your neighbor's orchard before the frost came. Nuts were a treat, hazelnuts, walnuts, chestnuts, and were often gathered during autumn to be eaten through the cold months. Herbs were your main weapon against flavor fatigue. You might grow parsley, sage, or thyme near your house, and you'd throw handfuls into pottage or bread dough to pretend you were living the high life. Salt was precious, so precious it was sometimes used as payment. If you had it, you guarded it like treasure because salted meat lasted longer and tasted like something other than sadness. Meat existed in the peasant diet, just not often. You might have pork from a pig slaughtered in late autumn, salted or smoked to last through winter. Fish was more common, especially if you lived near a river, lake, or the coast. Fresh fish was eaten quickly. Preserved fish, usually salted herring, could last months. And yes, it tasted like it had lasted months. Eggs and dairy were more common than meat. A couple of chickens could give you eggs most of the year, and a cow or goat could keep you in milk for cheese and butter. Cheese was a practical way to store milk without it spoiling, and it added some much-needed variety to your otherwise bread-heavy menu. On special occasions, or when the village celebrated a feast day, you might get a real spread. Roasted meat, fresh pies, honey, and strong ale. These moments were rare, but they made the months of cabbage soup feel almost worth it. So the rest of the medieval peasant menu was simple, repetitive, and entirely dependent on the season. You ate what you could grow, store, or trade for. And if you were lucky, what you could forage before someone else found it. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept you alive. And in the Middle Ages, that was the only review your dinner needed. For most of the year, your meals as a medieval peasant were predictable. Bread, pottage, vegetables, repeat until death. But a few times each year, the culinary gods smiled upon you. These were feast days, the medieval equivalent of a cheat day, except your cheat meal was still mostly cabbage. Feast days were tied to the church calendar, which was absolutely packed with saints, holy days, and religious excuses to stop working and eat. The richer the village, the more elaborate the celebration. For you, the humble peasant, this meant the possibility of luxury foods, things you'd only see a handful of times in your life. Meat was the big one. On a feast day, you might get beef, mutton, or roasted pork instead of your usual scraps of salted pig. If you were lucky, you might even taste game meat, deer, rabbit, or wild birds, especially if your lord was generous or showing off. Of course, hunting was mostly illegal for peasants, so any game meat you had came from the lord's table or from someone sneaky enough to poach without getting caught. Dairy also made a star appearance. Fresh butter and soft cheese were luxuries when most of the year's supply was preserved or rationed. Creamy milk puddings might show up at wealthier feasts, though for you they were probably just milk-heavy pottages with extra sweetener. Speaking of sweetener, honey was the medieval dessert aisle. Sugar existed but was imported and astronomically expensive, so you weren't getting that. Honey was far more common and often used in pies, pastries, or just drizzled over bread for the closest thing you'd ever get to dessert toast. Fish could also be a feast food, especially if it was fresh from a river or brought in from the coast. But religious fasting rules meant you might end up eating a lot of fish even outside feast days, especially during Lent when meat was banned. Fasting didn't mean eating less, by the way. It meant swapping out meat for fish, eggs, dairy, and more bread. And yes, People absolutely try to bend those rules, inventing dishes like meat-flavored fish pies that would fool no one but still pass church inspection. Alcohol flowed more freely on feast days, too. Ale and beer were the everyday drinks, but festivals meant stronger brews, better ingredients, and a higher chance of ending the day asleep in a haystack. If the Lord's wine cellar was open, you might even get a taste of watered wine, which was still a step up from the usual small beer. Foraging was another way to get special foods, especially in summer and autumn. Wild berries, mushrooms, and nuts could turn a boring pottage into something memorable. If you were bold or reckless, you might try new plants, but in the Middle Ages, new plant could also mean surprise poison. So, feast days and luxury foods were rare and fleeting, but they broke the monotony of the peasant diet. They were a reminder that food could be exciting, even if your definition of exciting was just bread with honey instead of cabbage soup. If you were a medieval peasant, your diet wasn't a choice. It was whatever you could grow, store, trade, or steal without getting caught. There was no, "What do I feel like for dinner?" There was only, "What will keep me alive until tomorrow?" The first rule of surviving on the peasant diet was portion control, but not in the modern health-conscious way. This wasn't about counting calories. It was about making sure the bread baked in October didn't run out by March. You ate enough to work, but never so much that you risked emptying the larder early. Hunger wasn't a once-a-year diet trend. It was a regular house guest. Seasonality was the second rule. You ate what was available when it was available. Summer meant fresh vegetables, berries, and fruit. Autumn meant grains, nuts, and anything you could preserve for winter. By late winter, the dreaded hungry gap, you were living off stored beans, the last of the onions, and bread so stale you could sand furniture with it. To keep things interesting, you learned the art of culinary disguise. That meant turning the same ingredients into slightly different dishes, so you could pretend you weren't eating the same thing for the 74th day in a row. Pottage with cabbage. Sure, pottage with turnip instead. Wow, it's like a whole new world. Bread dipped in ale for breakfast, then toasted by the fire for dinner. Now that's fine dining. Food shortages were the real test of survival. A bad harvest could wipe out your grain supply, and then you were in trouble. You'd bulk out bread with peas, beans, chestnuts, or acorns, anything to make the flour last. If things got truly desperate, you foraged for roots, wild greens, and anything vaguely edible. The line between resourceful and poisoned was thin, and a lot of medieval survival came down to knowing which mushrooms wouldn't kill you. The psychological battle of the peasant diet was just as hard as the physical one. When you know your next meal will look exactly like your last one, it's easy to lose enthusiasm. This is where community meals came in. Sharing food at the end of harvest, pooling ingredients for a festival, or just eating with neighbors to make things feel less bleak. Misery loves company, and so does cabbage soup. Despite its limitations, the peasant diet had one upside, and it worked. It kept you alive, fueled your work in the fields, and could be adapted depending on the season. You weren't eating for pleasure, you were eating for survival. If you happened to enjoy it, that was just a bonus. So how do you survive on a peasant diet without losing your will to live? You pace yourself, you respect the seasons, you make the same 3 ingredients feel like 12, and you remember that the occasional feast day with fresh bread, honey, maybe even meat, is proof that life isn't all turnips and sadness.